As we continue to worship the Lord this morning, church, we are continuing our verse-by-verse study through the book of Daniel. We began some time ago. We were interrupted by Hurricane Laura, and now we're finishing up the book. Remember that the prophet Daniel is writing as a prisoner. He is now under the rule of the kingdom of Persia. As a young boy, he was taken by Nebuchadnezzar under the Babylonians as a prisoner, a slave, into exile to serve the king of Babylon. The king of Babylon was then conquered by the king of Persia, and now Daniel is living under Persian rule, and he's looking forward to the day when he might get to return home to Jerusalem. Some of the exiles have already returned home, and Jerusalem is left in tatters. And at the end of the book of Daniel, God sends an angel. In fact, the Lord Jesus himself appears in chapter 10, and then this angel steps in to reveal what is going to happen in the future. So after a vision of the Son of Man, the Lord Jesus Christ, in chapter 10, who appears in power and glory, and Daniel falls down overcome by the glory of God the Son. Then the angel restores Daniel and says, now I must tell you what will happen from this point. Daniel was probably writing around 538, 537 BC. From this point in time until the very end of history. And so we began in chapter 11, verse 2 last week, looking at the history of the earth, which is yet to take place in Daniel's day. Now, I want you to understand that the sermon last week was full of a lot of dates and kings in history. We looked at 6 Greek kings who ruled over the empire of Greece, the first, of course, being Alexander the Great. And then his kingdom was divided up into 4 parts. And there were all these stories about the king of the north and the king of the south and the king of the east and the west and how they fought against one another. And you might have almost fallen asleep. Even some of you might have gazed at the back of your eyelids. I don't know. I didn't notice. But I just want to say to you that it's important for this reason. Because in the midst of this struggle, Israel, God's people, were being thrown back and forth like a pinball as these great powerful kingdoms warred against them. Because as you look at the ancient map of the Greek Empire, which has been divided up north, south, east, and west, do you know what's in the middle of those 4? The land of Israel. And the Jewish people were suffering greatly as these kingdoms on all 4 sides of them were warring with one another. And so the point of Daniel 11 is that God's people are going to go through tremendous suffering and persecution until the end of time. And it won't just be the Jews and the Israelites in the days of the Old Covenant leading up to the coming of Jesus, but we're also going to see next week that even the church and all of God's children, be they Jewish or Gentiles, that all of God's people will suffer persecution until Jesus comes finally at the end of history in power and glory to usher in His eternal kingdom. And so Daniel 11 stands as this great testimony to God's faithfulness to His people throughout time and history. And what's incredible about Daniel 11 is, I would say, it is the most specific prophecy in the entire Bible. Meaning that it foretells specific details that would happen for 400 years after Daniel wrote the book. Daniel, writing in the 530s BC, will take us up to the year 164 BC and tell us everything that's going to happen in that roughly 400-year period after Daniel wrote the book. And it's contained here from Daniel 11, verse 2 to verse 35. That's that stretch of time leading up until the New Testament and the coming of Christ. And so as we're going to finish out that period of time. We're going to look at events today that took place between 175 to 164 BC. And as we look at these things and you say, well, what do things that happened 2,200 years ago have to do with me today? I want you to know that in verse 36, you and I are going to be read into the story, and we are going to realize that God intends us to learn from what generations of God's people have gone through before us so that we will be able to stand during the trials of our day. Because next week, we're going to start in verse 36 of chapter 11, and we're going to look at the coming of the lawless one, the one that the New Testament identifies as the Antichrist of the end times, and how he will severely persecute God's people. Now, we're not there yet, but we're going to look today in Daniel 11, verses 21 to 35, and we're going to look at a man who is a precursor to the Antichrist, a type of the Antichrist. He is going to persecute God's people, and these are events that happen before our day, but after Daniel's day. And this man, Antiochus Epiphanes, also called Antiochus IV, this last great Greek king of the Seleucid Empire, he severely persecuted the Jewish people. And we are going to learn from their persecution, because then Daniel is going to hear that the saints of God who live at the very end of history, just before the return of Jesus, are going to go through a similar persecution that will actually be even worse. So this morning, we're in Daniel 11, verse 21, and we have come up to this point in history where these 6 Greek kings have arisen and fallen, and the narrative now is focusing on the king of the north, that's the Seleucid Empire, and the king of the south, that's the Ptolemaic Empire. The Seleucid Empire is in Syria. The Ptolemaic Empire is in Egypt. And between Syria and Egypt on the map is Israel, right? And so these 2 kingdoms are going to war with one another. And we read in verse 21, in his place, that is the last Seleucid ruler, in his place shall arise a contemptible person to whom royal majesty has not been given. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. So after the last ruler that we heard about, Philopator, this man who raised all these taxes to pay back the Romans for the war debt that they had in the failed campaign of the king before him, Antiochus III, now that man dies, and a new man is going to take over. And he is known as Antiochus Epiphanes. He believed himself to be a manifestation of God himself. But remember, his father called himself Antiochus Theos, that is Antiochus the God. So Antiochus Epiphanes, compared to his father, was a little more humble. He said he was only a manifestation of God. But anyways, obviously a pagan, blasphemous, wicked ruler. And now he is going to rule over the kingdom of the Seleucids, the northern part of the remnants of the Greek Empire from Alexander the Great's day. So he takes the throne, but when he comes, he claims to rule in place of his older brother Demetrius. So it says here in verse 21, it shall come to a contemptible person to whom the royal majesty has not been given. You see that in verse 21? He's one to whom the royal majesty has not been given. He comes in without warning and he obtains the kingdom by flattery. Now what that is saying is, and it's incredible, remember Daniel wrote this hundreds of years before it ever happened. It's a powerful testimony to the truth of Scripture and the accuracy of biblical prophecy that Antiochus came in. His older brother Demetrius should have been king in his place, but Demetrius had been captured by the Romans and he was at that time in prison in Rome. So Antiochus IV says, well listen, while my brother is in prison, hopefully the Romans will release him soon, I'm just going to watch over the Seleucid Empire. I'm going to watch over the kingdom until my brother gets released. And so he steps into office, as it were, as kind of a placeholder for the true king. And when he gets in, he begins to obtain the kingdom by flattery. He begins to spend money. He takes the wealth of the kingdom and he buys off the nobles, the politicians of his day, to get their support and to get them behind him being king and not allowing his brother to later come back and take over the kingdom. We read in verse 22, "Armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken, even the prince of the covenant." Which is to say that this is going to be a man who will cause great devastation. Verse 22 is basically a summary of Antiochus IV's life. He will be a man who, in a period of approximately 12 years, will cause absolute devastation and tremendous warfare. And that is exactly what happens. Verse 23, "And from the time that an alliance is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, and he shall become strong with a small people." So, verse 23 tells us about how he came in with flattery and obtained the kingdom. It gives us more details about what Antiochus did. So, it says in verse 23, he makes an alliance. I'm going to take over the kingdom for a short time, and I'm going to rule in my brother Demetrius' place until he comes in. But like I said, he begins to buy off the nobles and the rulers. And he also begins to amass a military force of very elite armed Greek soldiers around him. And so now he has the support of many of the politicians that he has personally bought and paid for their support. And he has a military force around him, so he is amassing power so that he can take over the kingdom. And even if his brother comes back, his brother will not be able to overthrow him. So it says he shall become strong with a small people. And that's exactly what Antiochus did. He had a small group of nobles and elite military leaders and soldiers amassed around himself so that he could take over the Seleucid Empire. Verse 24. Daniel prophesies, "And without warning he shall come into the richest parts of the province, and he shall do what neither his father nor his fathers have done, scattering among them plunder, spoil, and good. He shall devise plans against strongholds, but only for a time." He begins to go throughout the kingdom and buy off the towns and the officials, and he spreads this pattern of buying off people and getting them behind his support. In fact, it says here that he will devise plans to take over strongholds. And one of those plans and schemes that he hatched was to take over the region of Israel by reappointing its most powerful ruler, that is the high priest in Jerusalem. So at the time that Antiochus came into power, there was a man who is a direct descendant of Aaron, Moses' brother, who was the high priest in Israel. His name was Onias III. And we read a little bit about this that was previously prophesied in Daniel 8, but now in Daniel 11, the prophet gives us some more detail. And I want to go more into what happened. Onias III was the high priest in Jerusalem at this time, and he was a faithful Old Covenant Jew. Remember, the high priest would be the only official who would be allowed to go into the innermost part of the temple, the Holy of Holies, and that only on the Day of Atonement. This man was the key leader in the nation of Israel at this time as they were under the rule of the Seleucid Empire. And so Antiochus doesn't like the fact that there is this really religiously pious, conservative Jew who's getting in his way of really controlling the land of Israel and the Jewish people. So Onias has a younger brother named Jason. Now his name was Jason, and that's a Greek name because his younger brother really didn't like to identify as a Jew, even though he was one. So he forsook his Jewish name and took a Greek name, Jason, because he wanted to be more like the Greeks rather than like his Jewish heritage. And so Jason goes to Antiochus and he says, "Listen, I know my brother is very devout and he's very serious, but you're trying to do something new and big here. You're trying to make Israel, a Greek land where we worship Greek gods and do things in the Greek way. And I want you to know that if you will remove my brother Onias from being high priest, I'll come in and I'll do your bidding. I will make the people accept Greek religion and the Greek gods, and I will raise more tax money for you. And Antiochus IV, being the wicked, evil politician and ruler that he was, said, more control, more money, sounds good to me. And so he deposes Onias III and puts his younger brother Jason in his place. It's a lesson to be learned here for those who would launch a coup against a political official before themselves. What worked for Jason also will work against him. Then there is a complete pagan who has no claim to the Aaronic line of the priesthood. His name is Menelaus. And he comes up and he says, now wait, if Antiochus deposed the real high priest, Onias, and put his brother in place, well, I wonder what will happen if I promise the king more power and more tax revenue. And so Menelaus goes to Antiochus and he says, listen, Jason's not doing a good enough job. He ought to be raising more money for you, and he ought to get the people behind your program. If you get rid of Jason and put me in his place, I'll do it. And Antiochus says, well, I'm all for that. More power, more money. And he puts Menelaus in his place. It's a pretty incredible lesson. But what you need to understand, and what Daniel is prophesying here, is that the king is going to use all types of schemes to devise plans against strongholds. But it says here at the end of verse 24, this will last only for a time. All of these schemes end up failing, and those who try to plot with Antiochus only last a matter of a mere few months or maybe a few years, and then they fall out of power. It's exactly as the prophet Daniel foretold. Now look at verse 25. It says, and he shall stir up his power and his heart against the king of the south with a great army. Remember that the king of the north, the Seleucids, and the king of the south, the Ptolemies, they were constantly going to war with one another. And so Daniel says that war is going to start back up at this time. So the king of the north, Antiochus IV, is going to stir up his power and his heart against the king of the south. Now the king of the south at this time is a man named Ptolemy VI. And so he is the man who had married the young queen Cleopatra I. And so the king of the south, it says, shall wage war with an exceedingly great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for plot shall be devised against him. Daniel says that the king of the south is going to have a greater army, but he is going to fail to conquer the king of the north when he comes against him. Now, this is interesting. I mean, how will this happen? How will he fail if he has a greater army? Well, look at verse 27. Verse 26. Look at it carefully. Even those who eat his food shall break away from him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. Verse 26 tells you how the king of the south, with a much larger and greater army, is going to lose to the king of the north. He's going to lose in verse 26 because those who eat his own food shall break him. That is Ptolemy VI, the king of the south. His most innermost advisors and military officials launched a coup against him. And they said, we're going to take our king and we're going to march him up to go to war with Antiochus IV, the king of the north. And when we get there, we're going to surround him and deliver him over to the king. So they are going to essentially betray their king, and then they're going to hand him over to Antiochus, the king of the north, when they gather for battle. And then they're going to hope that Antiochus is going to give them more power and control. And so it says in verse 26, the ones who eat his food, that is his closest, most trusted advisors, will break him, and his army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. It's just incredible that Daniel could prophesy these events so specifically. So what this does is it further empowers Antiochus IV, the king of the north that we are told is going to persecute God's people. It further emboldens him because now he has power over the north and the south of the Greek Empire. Verse 27. And as for the two kings, their heart shall be bent on doing evil. They shall speak lies at the same table, but to no avail, for the end is yet to be at the time appointed. So what happens after Ptolemy VI is captured? So he goes with Antiochus, and in the meantime, although he's serving Antiochus, Ptolemy VI is no longer in Egypt, in the city of Alexandria, the capital of Egypt, and he has a younger brother, Ptolemy VIII, who takes over the throne. Now you might be asking the question, okay, where's Ptolemy VII? Well, Ptolemy VII is the infant son of Ptolemy VI. He's still in diapers, so he doesn't try to take over the throne, but his uncle does. And so his uncle, he's known by his Greek name, Potbelly. And so he was a corpulent fat man, and he takes over the throne in the place of his uncle, who is the rightful ruler, Ptolemy VI. Okay, so if you're following along, what ends up happening is that now Ptolemy VI, who has had the throne taken away from him by Ptolemy VIII, wants to get the throne back, and Antiochus has lost control over the south, over Egypt, so he decides with Ptolemy VI, whom he had captured before, that they're going to go back and take over Egypt. But it says here in verse 27, they will speak lies at the same table. So the king of the north and the king of the south are going to devise a plan together, but they're going to lie to one another, and so their plans will come to nothing. You see, Ptolemy VI wants to return back and get Antiochus to help him take over Egypt, but then once he gets Egypt back, he's no longer going to pay honor and tribute to the king of the north. And the same thing, the king of the north says, look, I'm going to help you out, but his plan was to do away with Ptolemy VI in the first place. So these two scheming politicians are not only scheming against Ptolemy VIII, but they're also scheming against one another. Well, what happens? Their plans come to nothing. That's exactly what Daniel had prophesied would happen in verse 27. So then it says in verse 28, and he shall return to his land with great wealth, but his heart shall be set against the holy covenant, and he shall work his will and return to his own land. What this means is that Ptolemy VI ends up going back to Alexandria without Antiochus' help to try to take over the kingdom and overthrow it from Ptolemy VIII. But it doesn't work, and he ends up being driven out of Egypt, and Ptolemy VI, who can't get his kingdom back, flees to Rome for help. Now, at this point in history, in the 2nd century BC, the Roman Empire is just beginning to get power and influence and strength. Okay? The Romans are just rising up on the world stage. And so Ptolemy VI knows about this, so he flees to Rome, and he goes to the Roman Senate, and he asks for their help to get Egypt back under his rightful rule. So, as this has happened in the meantime, we move to verse 29. And at the appointed time he shall return and come into the south, but it shall not be this time as it was before. So Ptolemy VI and Antiochus IV come back, and they try to take over Egypt from Ptolemy VIII. As this happens, Antiochus comes back, in verse 29 prophesied that he will find that it will not be this time as it was before. The previous time Antiochus went to Egypt, he took it easily, right? And the king's most trusted advisors just delivered him into his hands. Well, not so this time, because he shows back up and there are Roman soldiers in Egypt. There's not just the Egyptian soldiers, there's the armies of Rome there. And there is a man who is there who has charge of the Roman armies. He's a Roman senator named Gaius Popillius Laenas. In verse 30 prophesies what this Roman senator would do as he has control over the Roman armies that are there. It says in verse 30, for ships from Kittim shall come against him, and he shall be afraid and withdraw, and he shall turn back and be enraged and take action against the holy covenant. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the holy covenant. Kittim, being in the west, says that the foreign army that's going to come here will come from the west. And of course, Rome is to the west of Syria and Egypt. So these ships come from Kittim. By the way, I think this probably has a connection to the prophecy, the fourth prophecy of Balaam in Numbers 24, verse 24. as it prophesies there that before the time of the coming of the Messiah, there would be this alliance between the ships that come from Kittim and these other kings. I think this may be a connection intended by the prophet Daniel to a previous prophecy by Moses in Numbers 24:24. But regardless, it's well known that Kittim would have been to the west in a previous day, in the day of Moses. And so a western army will come in, verse 30 prophesies, and shall come against the king of the north, Antiochus IV. And he shall be afraid and withdraw. He'll be afraid and withdraw. What are we talking about? Well, history tells us that this Roman senator, Gaius Popilius Lanus, he comes in and he says to Antiochus, look, you want to go to war with Egypt? Well, we have a treaty with Egypt now in Rome. So if you're going to go to war with Egypt, you're going to fight Rome too. And you can't beat both of us. So you need to make up your mind. Are you going to agree right now to never attack Egypt again, or are we going to have to destroy you? Your choice, Antiochus. And so Antiochus thinks for a minute and he says, well, let me go back and talk to my generals and I'll get back to you with an answer later. And Popilius says, no, that's not good enough. And he takes his sword and he goes around Antiochus IV and he draws a circle, a line in the sand around him. This is where the famous phrase, drawing the line in the sand, comes from. Now someone might say, wait, I thought it came from the Alamo when they drew the line in the sand at the Alamo. That's true, but the soldiers who fought at the Alamo got it from here, from the Romans. And so the first time the line was drawn in the sand was here before Antiochus IV. And the Roman senator draws a line around Antiochus and he says, I want your answer now. If you step outside of the line without promising to leave and never come back to Egypt, then we're going to get our armies and we're going to destroy your army and take you as our prisoner. What's it going to be? Well, what does verse 30 prophesy will happen? He shall be afraid and withdraw. And that's exactly what Antiochus did. He knew he could not defeat the armies of Egypt and Rome. And so Antiochus said, I promise never to come back to Egypt again. The kingdom of the north is going to stop attacking the kingdom of the south, as has been happening for hundreds of years now. And he goes back to Syria, where the Seleucid Empire is headquartered, with his tail between his legs. Now listen at what verse 30 prophesies will happen when he goes back. He shall turn back and he shall be enraged and take action against the holy covenant. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsook the holy covenant. What's between Egypt and Syria? Israel. As he goes back with his army, all dressed up, ready to go to battle with his tail between his legs, and they're not going to fight anymore because he met two armies that he could not defeat. Antiochus feels defeated. And no doubt his soldiers were questioning his leadership. He had brought them hundreds of miles to fight, and now they have given up and they're headed back home. And along the way, they come through the land of Israel, and Antiochus gets an idea. I know, we'll go attack Jerusalem. They can't stop us, and we'll steal everything they have, and I can enrich my soldiers, and I can not go back totally defeated, but say that I conquered someone and got something out of this military campaign. That's exactly what verse 30 prophesied he would do. Verse 31 says, forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and the fortresses. What ends up happening is that he goes into Jerusalem and he absolutely tears the place apart. Antiochus goes in and he puts soldiers up in front of the temple and he says, we're no longer going to worship Yahweh here. At this temple in Jerusalem, we are going to worship the god Zeus. No one worships Yahweh, the God of Israel, anymore. Your God is now Zeus. And we're no longer going to sacrifice lambs and bulls and goats, but we're going to sacrifice pigs to Zeus. Now, if you know anything about the Old Testament, you know that there is nothing more detestable and unholy than a pig. And Antiochus, to prove his point, goes into the most holy place in the temple, the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest was supposed to go, and he takes a pig and he slaughters it over the altar of God in the Holy of Holies. You could not think of a more horrific way to disgust and humiliate the Jewish people than to sacrifice a pig in the Holy of Holies over the altar in the temple in Jerusalem. But that's exactly what Antiochus does. It says, they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate in verse 31. And that almost is certainly a reference to the sacrificing of the pig in the Holy of Holies in the temple. Antiochus also ordered that Jews could no longer observe their Sabbaths or their Jewish festivals, and they no longer could circumcise their male children. What he did was remove all of their Jewish religion from him, and he said, if you do these things, we're going to kill you. Well, some of the Jewish people decide to go along with this. Verse 32 prophesies, he shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, which is to say, some of the Jews are going to succumb and decide we don't want to fight against this. But then verse 32 says, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. Some of the Jewish people are not going to stand for this. They were known as the Hasidim. Have you ever heard of Hasidic Jews? They get their name from this group who stood against Antiochus IV, the Hasidim. And they said, no, we're going to practice our faith even if you kill us. Well, that's exactly what Antiochus does. He massacred thousands upon thousands of Jews. This was the Holocaust which happened under the Old Covenant. This Antiochus IV would rightly be compared to a man like Adolf Hitler. He killed scores and scores of Jews who would not submit to his new laws and his new rule. So it says in verse 33, the wise among the people shall make many understand, though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, and by captivity and plunder. Verse 34, and when they stumble they shall receive a little help, and many shall join themselves to them with flattery. Now, what happens is that there is a revolt that rises up. You see, the Greek soldiers are trying to force the Jews to worship Zeus and these pagan gods, and some of them don't want to go along with it. The little help that is mentioned here in verse 34 is almost certainly the Maccabean revolt that happened in this day. You can read about it in the Jewish history books, 1st and 2nd Maccabees. What happens is that the Greek soldiers go to a little town 20 miles outside of Jerusalem called Moda'in. And in this town, there is an 80-year-old priest named Matthias. And they come in and they say, all right, everyone is going to have to come. We're going to sacrifice pigs and we're going to worship the god Zeus. And Matthias, this 80-year-old priest, isn't standing for it. He pulls out his sword, and on the spot, he kills 8 of the Greek soldiers and a few of the Jews who were ready to sacrifice to the god Zeus. He was a bad old man. Well, this ends up launching a revolt, and the other towns hear about it, and the Jews flee out into the wilderness, and they launch this guerrilla campaign to drive the Greeks out of the land of Israel. And for a few years, they were successful. Matthias, who's an older man, can't handle the rigors of battle, and so he ends up dying a year later, and his son, Judas Maccabeus, takes over this revolution to drive the Greeks out of Israel. And within a year, they drive them out, and Judas Maccabeus retakes the temple in Jerusalem, and they reinstate the Jewish religion and the true Old Covenant sacrifices and worship. They go into the temple, and they light the lamps, and they don't have enough oil to keep the lamps burning, but as the story goes, whether it's true or not, they claim that miraculously, with a very little amount of oil, the lamps in the temple burned for 8 days.